The Goodwill Industries Hall of Fame recognizes retired Goodwill Industries chief executive officers, staff, donors, and others who have made exemplary contributions to the Goodwill Industries movement. In this presentation, we will learn about Hall of Fame member Percy J. Trevethan, known affectionately as PJ. Dr. Percy J. Trevethan was born March 12, 1899 at Hancock, Michigan. He was educated at the University of Michigan, George Williams College, and Boston University. He had begun a promising career in the sales department of Standard Oil of Indiana in 1923. In 1926, PJ and his wife, Anna Marie, decided to answer the call by Edgar Helms to make a career change to Goodwill. Helms had replied to PJ's letter of acceptance with the above quote. Upon arriving at Boston, they were surprised to learn that Helms had just left on a 7-month trip around the world, and he had left no word of their coming. No plans for them had been made. Anna Marie worked in a Goodwill store and PJ as a lay preacher for 7 months to earn enough money to survive. But PJ was soon moving up in Goodwill work as staff for Morgan Memorial Goodwill in Boston, and running the Executive Training School for the National Goodwill Organization. Today, Goodwill CEOs are recognized for outstanding leadership training with the Trevethan Award. Fred Moore, Boston Goodwill CEO, and PJ's boss, was ill, and PJ began to represent him at national board meetings. And soon PJ himself was elected to serve on the national board. Oliver Friedman, then GIA CEO, had asked Trevethan to join him in the national office. PJ finally agreed, and once there, the board suddenly made role changes for PJ and Oliver. PJ was nervous about this because he remembered that some still felt Oliver had pushed Dr. Helms out of his position of executive secretary. When Friedman retired, Trevethan was selected to become the third national CEO. Gerald Clore, former CEO, Dallas Goodwill, noted that PJ finally achieved the salary level he had at Standard Oil in 1926. Frank Flegel remembers PJ in the following video.
PJ was entirely different than Oliver Friedman. He was a warm, gregarious kind of a person. He had the knack of inspiring the group. If you had a conference and PJ spoke, after 4 or 5 minutes, you were following PJ, and he had that characteristic. He was an inspiration, I think, to the young executives. He had the spiritual impact on the movement, if that's the proper way to say it. He brought a cohesiveness to the Goodwill family. I think perhaps more than either Dr. Helms or Oliver, PJ encouraged the executives to be the movement. He relied on them, he asked their opinions, he formed committees of the leaders of the executive group, and in a sense, he used their judgment to help him mold the movement from the time he became the national executive.
As the new CEO, PJ immediately made changes. Not since Dr. Helms had the national publications had a global look. More services from the national office were demanded, and how to pay for them was a hot topic. PJ and Anna Marie are shown here with the 1953 GIA Board of Directors.
Shortly after I came on board in Dallas as a trainee, PJ and Bob Watkins were lieutenant. Gerald Clore had us out to their house, and we had hot dogs out in the backyard. The first time I met PJ, he was so formal in his style. A little picnic with a dozen people. He makes a speech to the point of, and in conclusion. Sometimes I was wondering what I was getting into.
Goodwill was becoming known around the world, and PJ represented Goodwill globally. But McKinnon, Detroit CEO, complained about using dues money for international travel. PJ pouted and said he would not go to a planned meeting. McKinnon backed down and said he was sorry, and would raise money for international travel so dues money would not be needed. GIA counsel John Harmon summed up the significance of the congressional action in 1954. The small beginning of vocational rehabilitation legislation, he said, which could have fallen into, quote, desuetude, was altered through Public Law 565, the Vocational Rehabilitation Amendments of 1954. Harmon continued to work toward more funding for facilities for many years. In a side note, Bob Watkins, who had left his position as CEO of LA Goodwill in 1953, returned to Goodwill as first National Field Services Director. At a time when the national office was establishing itself in D.C., the need for more money was ever more present. The CEOs began to meet annually in a separate meeting from the Delegate Assembly, which included local board members. PJ, having been Executive Vice President for 10 years, with some pressure from member CEOs, had suggested he would retire, but would not state a date. An international committee was formed by the Conference of Executives to support efforts to start Goodwills outside North America. Gerald Floor was selected to chair the committee. Frank Flegel, in the video above, said that more than Helms or Friedman, PJ encouraged the CEOs to be the movement. But interestingly, during this time a new all-community volunteer member board of directors was voted in. No Goodwill CEOs on the board, but a council of executives with 6 members was created to advise the board. With national interest in accreditation growing, no CEOs on the national board was just part of the efforts to update the organization.
PJ Trevethan was anxious to develop a self-accreditation program within Goodwill because he sensed that one was coming for the sheltered workshop movement. And I was chairman of that committee. We worked diligently, spent 2 or 3 years developing a formula and did some self-testing within the Goodwill movement. And I believe if our document were laid side by side with the first documents of what is now CARF, you'd find that they borrowed greatly from our Goodwill program at that point.
With a new idea for generating revenue, GIA Board President Nelson invited George A. Scott of the department store, Walker & Scott, to a board meeting. Scott said he was on the national board of the Salvation Army and was president of the board of the San Diego unit of the Volunteers of America. He described himself as an able fundraiser for such organizations. Trevethan said funds were desperately needed for several programs, including the establishment of a pilot Goodwill in a community of less than 85,000 population. Organizationally, the roles of the all-lay member board, the Council of Executives, and the Conference of Executives was not clear.
There was a period of several years when there was a switching back and forth as to the impact of the local Goodwill Executive Group on or as members of the national board. And out of that came what is now the Conference of Executives.
PJ soon became involved in national politics. Shown here was Jennings Randolph, Senator from West Virginia, James Doolin, GIA Board Treasurer, and Harold Snape, CEO of the D.C. Goodwill. PJ had hinted at retirement in 1959. Now some CEOs began to encourage PJ's retirement to the point of bringing a no-confidence vote to the Conference of Executives. Horace Kimbrough, board president, stepped in and negotiated 1966 as PJ's retirement date. Meanwhile, board member Scott continued to work toward a fundraising solution to the need for more revenue, but his proposed board of high-profile individuals was finally discarded, and the committee became the Program Planning and Finance Committee. Bob Galloway, CPA, a partner of Galloway and Marshall, and president of Canton, Ohio's Goodwill Industries, had been retained part-time to work with George Evans, executive director, Columbus, Ohio, to design the long-awaited standard accounting system under a Rehabilitation Services Administration planning grant. At this time, the Great Society of the United States was in turmoil. Vietnam and the decade of demonstrations for civil rights and equality for minorities was in full swing. On May 4, 1965, the House of Representatives passed the 1966 HEW Appropriations Act, including monies for the Vocational Rehabilitation Administration. However, the most significant feature of the Act for Goodwill was an amendment by Representative Melvin Laird of Wisconsin to authorize up to $5 million in federal matching funds where equivalent private funding could be provided for workshop establishment. The history of the Laird Amendment is a prime example of the successful work of GIA counsel John Harmon. Back in 1957, in a conference with then Assistant Secretary to HEW Elliot Richardson, Harmon had proposed that private funding for starting Goodwills be matched by federal finances so that rehabilitation services could be expanded more rapidly. In a side note, Robert Watkins was selected to follow Trevethan as GIA Executive Secretary. As planned, PJ retired in 1966. He continued a warm relationship with Goodwill and was retained by Bob Watkins as the consultant to Goodwill's international program until his death in 1976. Dr. Percy J. Trevethan gave up a promising career in the chemical industry to join Edgar Helms at Goodwill. He oversaw the growth of Goodwills in North America and in other countries with the increased need for services from GIA. A national fundraising effort to supplement dues from its members had failed, but efforts to secure federal funds for expansion of workshops was successful. Three of the more important results of his administration were the creation of the Conference of Executives, an accreditation program for sheltered workshops, and an international committee to support global growth of Goodwill. This is George Kessinger. Thank you for watching this Goodwill Industries International Hall of Fame presentation on Dr. Percy J. Trevethan. The Goodwill Industries Hall of Fame is located at Goodwill's Member Services Center, Rockville, Maryland. For more information, please send email to contactus@goodwill.org.